Welcome to the Eating Disorder Recovery Podcast.
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 Welcome to the Eating Disorder Recovery Podcast with me, Dr. Janine Anderson. Heads up, this show may contain adult language and may mention specific foods. If you find either of those to be too triggering, I trust you to take care of yourself and do what you need to do. Hello, friends. Just a quick announcement before we get to our interview with pediatric psychologist, Dr. Kelsey Latimer. Just wanted to say thank you so much for continuing to write me. I love hearing about what is going on for you all. I also wanted to put a request out there to please leave a review for the show on iTunes. It helps the show so much to find new listeners and to rise in the rankings so that more people who need the show will be able to find the show more easily. And then finally, I just wanted to kind of give you an update about the podcast and kind of the timeline for that. So as I've mentioned on the podcast before, I did write a book called Recovery or Perspective, and that book needs to be edited. So that means I need a lot more time available to be able to do that. And I love putting the podcast together for you all. And it's also taken me a lot more time to produce those episodes than I had initially anticipated. So what will be happening is the podcast is just going to slow down a bit over the summer. So I'm not stopping. I'm not going anywhere. The podcast is not being taken away. But over the summer, probably the next 2 months, probably maybe even 3, you'll notice that I'll be releasing 1 episode per month instead of an episode every other week. And again, that's just so I can go ahead and get the book edited as soon as possible. I'm trying to meet my goal timeline for getting that done. So just notice that over the summer, the podcast is just going to slow down a bit to 1 episode per month. All right. So now let's get to the interview. Today we're joined by Dr. Kelsey Latimer. Dr. Latimer is a psychologist who specializes in working with eating disorders in children. Dr. Latimer completed her doctorate in counseling psychology at the University of North Texas in 2009 with an emphasis area in neuropsychology and child/adolescent development. She completed her predoctoral internship at the University of Texas at Austin Counseling and Mental Health Center, where she focused on preceptorships in training and administration in eating disorders. Her postdoctoral work was done at Texas Christian University, where she provided specialized treatment in eating disorders, anxiety, and crisis management to the general student population and to the fraternity sorority life community. She is now a licensed psychologist at the Center for Pediatric Eating Disorders of Children's Health and Children's Medical Center, Plano. She works in all levels of care, including inpatient and partial hospitalization, and leads the intensive outpatient program. Her research is focused on eating disorder prevention and intervention and clinical outcomes of eating disorder programs. Dr. Latimer has presented at over 40 regional, national, and international conferences on topics of eating disorder treatment, body image, and supervision and training. She has also been featured as a media expert source on Fox 4, Cosmopolitan.com, The Washington Post, Gers Books newsletter, Brit & Co., and Yahoo Style. So please help me welcome Dr. Kelsey Latimer. Thanks for joining us, Dr. Latimer.
Thank you so much for having me, Dr. Janine.
We are so happy to have you. I know a lot of people are excited and have questions for you, but I thought we would kind of start with your background and let people get to know you a little bit, how you got into the field, and later we'll talk a little bit about what it's like to work with kiddos in this area.
Sounds great. So to tell you a little bit about my background, and I appreciate you reading the technical aspects, which your audience has now heard some of my background and the different things that I've gone through before coming here to the Center for Pediatric Eating Disorders as the lead psychologist. But one of the things I like to speak about that I think is probably helpful for your audience is just recognizing the incredibly important influence of networking and reaching out and asking people for opportunities. That's something that I always like to let people know about because oftentimes they don't know how much of an influence that can have in getting you to the point where you're at. And so I say that because as I think about my path and what led me to eventually being here studying eating disorders, it didn't start off like that for me. When I was in college, I always had an interest in psychology and the way the mind works and all of that. But one of the things that led me to working with kids initially was actually having an adjunct professor who wasn't even supposed to be teaching that course for the semester, talking about his experience in working at a pediatric hospital. And I just simply happened to take the risk to go up to him after class and say, hey, I'm going into my senior year. I'm interested in possibly doing an internship. Do you have anything available at the hospital that you're working at? And he said, you know what? Interestingly, I do. And so I started doing some simple data entry, did a really good job, took it seriously. And when the time came for me to graduate, because I had done a good job, there was an opportunity for me to take on a research assistant position. So one of the things I feel like is so important is just always recognizing the opportunities that are available and always seeing people as important parts of your network that don't go away. And really one of the things that I always do that I encourage your listeners to do, especially parents out there, is to listen to their gut instincts and reactions to things. And that's something I take extremely personally myself. And so I'm always listening to my inner gut telling me what the next step in my professional career is too. And so I did that knowing that, right from working at that first pediatric hospital to loving the kids that I was working with and feeling like I want to take the next steps. I want to do more. How do I do that? Well, I need to go and get my higher education degree, my doctorate in counseling psychology, and I can take that next step. And then from there, realize that one of the things that I love about working with kids is seeing kind of the things that they're exposed to that they don't necessarily know or understand, and that you can provide them with what I call a language to explain those things and possibly affect the impact, have a positive impact on their entire lives, whether it be with substance abuse or whether it be with identifying what's healthy or unhealthy in a relationship. And of course, my particular area of interest, which is focusing on creating a healthy body image. So I've done that in everything that I've worked through, and all the way up to my current position here as lead psychologist. I can honestly tell you, if I was writing the perfect job description for me, it was this particular job that came up. It has everything that I love to do. So I'm very, very, very lucky to be in the place that I'm at. And I can't stress enough to your listeners about listening to your gut reactions. They will never lead you astray.
Yeah, I love all of what you just said, just from the professional point. And it's always interesting to see how things unfold and where you wind up and what you wind up liking. And I've had some things that have definitely been unexpected too. There's no way I ever would have thought that I would do a podcast ever. Like the least likely person to do it.
I didn't think I'd be on this end with you either. If I had to say a year ago, where would I be? I wouldn't be thinking, hey, I'm going to be recording this podcast. So it really is about listening to those internal gut instincts and where they lead you. So I think that's great that you also feel that way.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I know a lot of people were excited to know that we were having someone come on who specializes in kids, because I think most of us at least think of that as kind of maybe the earlier points in the development of an eating disorder and a great point in time for intervention. And I love that you love working with kids so much and that your enthusiasm and caring for it is so clear. We talked a little bit before we recorded this podcast, and I just have so much admiration and respect for people who work with kiddos. I don't work with kiddos very frequently, and I think a lot of people like myself think of that as very challenging work. But you were talking about how really it's not only very rewarding work, but also like a very rich place to do work.
Absolutely.
What's different with working with kids versus working with young adults or adults?
Right. Yeah, and it's so interesting because we were talking before this, and you had mentioned what a lot of people mentioned to me, which is, wow, I can't believe that you work with kids. That must be so hard. How do you do that? And to be honest with you, it is honestly not hard for me at all. It's something that I love to do every single day. I come in and I actually talk to the kids and the families about, sometimes I can't believe they pay me to do this. Mm-hmm. Now, believe me, there are other days where I really know why they pay me to do this. Because, we have our challenges. Yeah. But so often I honestly think if they really knew how much I loved this, if they really knew how easy some of this work is, they would recognize that they shouldn't be paying me for this. Because it's an incredibly, I feel honored to be able to do the work that I do and to be able to work with the incredible kids that I work with, and families for that matter too. So kids that are primed to have eating disorders just tend to be these amazing human beings. They just have no idea how incredible and amazing they are. And they are incredibly gifted. They tend to be extremely bright. They're extremely well-versed in recognizing society and what society wants from them, which can be, both a blessing and a curse. They're well in tuned with other people and what people want and need. They are giving and kind and just all of these amazing things. Now, put all of that together in a therapy room and tell me again that that's hard to work with. It's really, really not. Because you can do anything with them. And they're so open, when they start to realize the impact that the eating disorder or the body image stuff has had on them, then they become extremely open to honestly being able to think through all of the things that they can do to help themselves. So that's one of the things that I love, in working with kids, particularly this population, is they are just incredible human beings. And they're going to go on to do amazing things. They just don't know how to get it to work for them right now. Another thing that I love to do in working with kids is that, again, is such a blessing, is when you work with a child, you never just work with a child. You work with the family.
Right.
You never just work with a child, because a child is under the age of 18, meaning that the family is even more of an influence than they are, when we become adults. And so one of the beautiful things that I feel extremely passionately about is taking that and thinking, what can we do to help this family? Because eating disorders don't just happen to kids, they happen to the family. And they start to make parents question themselves, question, how can I parent? A very good parent that maybe felt confident about themselves before, all of a sudden thinks, I don't even know how to feed my child anymore. So it attacks the most basic of parental competencies or confidence. So I have the fortunate place of being able to help a family to overcome the eating disorder, to recognize you do know how to parent your child. You do know, your parental instincts are there. We just need to kind of bring them to the forefront again and empower you, because the eating disorder took away the power in your family, not just your child's power. And so the beautiful thing about that is when we have a family-based program, as we do here at the Center for Pediatric Eating Disorders, you have the ability to influence and impact change within the entire system, because even the best of families have imperfections. I know I have them in my family too, even though I grew up in a great family. So we can identify some of those things. We might be able to say, oh, hey, Mom, the way that you're talking about yourself sounds like maybe, you might have some body image concerns. How do we handle that? We can help the family. Or, hey, you guys are such a positive family that I wonder if you realize that maybe that's put a lot of pressure on this little one here to think that they have to be perfect too. Let's take a look at how we're communicating in the family and how we can change that maybe a little bit to make it more effective for everybody. So we help families, and we help families disconnect from the shame that comes with eating disorders too. And I know we can talk a whole lot more about that if you feel like your audience needs to know more about that. Oh,
sure. Yeah, we're definitely going to talk more about that and more about the family piece and what people can do.
So affecting change within the family is an incredible side impact that I don't think I even knew was going to come along with this, that has just been so incredibly fulfilling for me as a professional. Because when we send them back and we've worked with the family, then we send them back to a system that is healed. So the system then is able to reinforce all of the things that we've taught that patient, all of the things that we know can be the little things in the family that can create change. And it then has lasting impact. So that's one thing that's just incredible about working with kids.
Right.
And also, one of the other things that I feel like is so great for me is that when you think about adults with body image or eating disorder issues, or really any other issues, they have to know that they have a problem. And they have to think, number one, I have a problem. Number two, is it big enough for me to get help? And number three, am I going to get help? And am I going to accept the help? So there's a lot of things that go into that are very challenging, because many of us, when we have an issue, other people are first to know about that issue before we are. We have protective mechanisms that maybe don't let us see that we have an issue. So the beautiful thing about working with children is that the family does know their child. They know, hey, something isn't right here. I'm seeing changes go on. I'm seeing my child, maybe they're looking a little bit thinner. Maybe their personality is changing a little bit. Maybe their relationship with food appears to be a little bit different. And so if I can get the family to follow those instincts, then they can seek out treatment for the patient. The patient doesn't necessarily know or need to know, I have a problem and I'm going to get help for that. They can come in, they can be angry that they're being brought to treatment. They can be in that kind of denial stage. And we can work with that because the family is the one that brings them into treatment. And we can help them move past that point of denial so they can see, hey, wait a minute, maybe I do have an issue. Maybe I do want to do something different about it. So there's so much power, I guess, in working with children, from them themselves to the amazing families that we contact and work with every single day. And they become part of the children's family. We have kids that keep in touch with us and families that keep in touch with us 10 years out from treatment.
That's the best.
Because, they got married, or they're doing really well, or they're going on to college, or these amazing things.
Right. That's wonderful stuff. I was thinking too, something that I've said, I believe on the podcast and just say, and generally with clients all the time, is the downside of having the eating disorder and having it affect virtually every aspect of your life is that that's a really hard process. But the other side of the coin, the good part about that is that when you recover, every part gets better. And so you're speaking specifically to the individual, but also the family healing as a whole. And I know that that's got to be beautiful to see.
It's incredible to see. And, the way that I'm lucky enough because I get to work at all levels of care. So, I get to see them when they come in at their worst. And kids come in, it's quite incredible when we see this. Some kids come in at 60% or less of their ideal body weight. So imagine having 40% of you gone right now. We see kids come in extremely, extremely sick and ill and on the brink of death, unfortunately, sometimes. And, you see them kind of the shell of a human being. And then I see them all the way through our lowest level of care, which is the intensive outpatient program. And this is at the point where we've handed back a ton of power. The family knows what they're doing. They have a good sense of, okay, the eating disorder isn't gone, but we know what to do and how to handle it. And we know we have the support that we can reach out for when we need it. And let me tell you how incredible it is to see some of the personalities that emerge that you have no idea. You really don't know how the personality is going to emerge. I've seen some kids who, they're incredibly shy, very fearful of social interactions when they come in the beginning of treatment. And they're like social butterflies, or these incredibly extroverted, silly, funny people at the end of treatment. And you never know exactly what you're going to see. But that tells you how damaging, the eating disorder has been. And the families, when they leave here, one of the things that we do is we celebrate the emergence of not only the true self of the person back, but of the family.
Yeah.
And so we have a goodbye group at the end of their treatment that every patient and every family gets to tell them what they've learned from them. Not only the patient, but the family too. And each of us as a staff member gets to say that too. And when I know we have done our job is when a family says, we felt like we were the only ones on your unit. We knew that there were 25 other families, but we've always felt like we were the only ones. And you helped us give our child back. And ultimately, we know that we're going to be able to be the ones that make that continue to happen. So it's just so rewarding because, just like you said, you're helping the family become a better family. And because they have gone through this eating disorder, there's a term in the field that many of your listeners have probably heard of, which is called post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD.
Mm-hmm.
And it's the idea of stress that comes out of these horrible events. But there's another less well-known term in the field called post-traumatic growth. And
that's where it's at.
Right?
Yeah.
Because I have been through this incredibly difficult thing in my life, I am now going to reach this new potential that I never knew I had before. And I think that that's what we see happen so often is these people realize they have this incredible power and strength that they never knew they had before. So because they had an eating disorder, they're going to go on to reach higher potential probably than they ever were before. Again, thinking about when we successfully treat it. So it's just an incredible thing to be a part of every day.
Well, I want to segue a little bit into what causes eating disorders, because we haven't talked about that specifically on the podcast. And I really want to kind of explore and talk about how it's not one single thing ever that creates an eating disorder. And I think that parents, especially if they have a kid who has an eating disorder, feel so responsible for that a lot of the time and experience a lot of shame. So I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about what I call the perfect storm that creates eating disorders.
Yes, and I think that is such an effective way to speak about it. And you're right. When we have families that come in, sometimes they come in very defensive because they feel like we're going to say, here's what you did to cause this. And that's never the case, honestly, because if it were one thing, then every single person that was exposed to that thing would develop an eating disorder, right? And we know that that's not the case. Only 5% of the population actually develops a clinical eating disorder, though a lot more than that, up to 40 to 60% will have some sort of disordered eating in their lifetime. So it's not just one thing. And of course, the family, this happens to the best of families with the best of intentions. So I really want to make it incredibly clear, if there's one thing that can come out of this for your audience, you are not to blame for your child having an eating disorder, even if you yourself had one, or even if you yourself made a comment that maybe wasn't the most sensitive to your child. You didn't cause that eating disorder. So it absolutely is a perfect storm, and I like to think about it in terms of, what is a perfect storm in general. So if you think about like a tornado, I think about a tornado being a perfect storm because it doesn't happen with every single supercell thunderstorm that comes around. It's like the perfect emergence of that cold air coming from the north mixed with that warm air of the south, and being right in the perfect area in the central middle part of the country where all the conditions come together, and boom, we have a tornado that emerges. And even when those conditions are the same every single time, they may not then spin a tornado, right? So we can't even necessarily predict or know exactly when it's going to happen, even if the conditions are primed for it. So I think about that in terms of a perfect storm. So in relation to the development of an eating disorder, what we know is that the perfect storm kind of focuses on three different factors. So the first one would be the biological factor. And so some kids are going to be more primed for developing an eating disorder simply because of their genetics, because their genetics have eating disorders in their family history.
Right.
There's a lot of genetic studies out there right now that are trying to identify if they're an eating disorder gene, those types of things. And there's been estimates as high as about 75% of eating disorders may be or linked to a genetic component. So we can't do anything about that, though, right? So I don't like to focus too much on the biological because it can make us feel very helpless. Like, well,
right.
I can't do anything about my genes.
Right.
But even in terms of these kids maybe being also primed for anxiety issues and stuff like that, identifying the biological, though, can be really helpful because when you're working on what we call a multidisciplinary team, so a team of professionals who come from different backgrounds, psychiatrists, psychologists, nutritionists, all of us coming together to treat that eating disorder, we can treat each aspect of it. So identifying that biological piece, which we do at our center, we have psychiatrists that might say, okay, so you do have a little bit of, you're primed for this because maybe you have this or this, you have anxiety, you have depression, these types of things. And here's maybe a medication that we can do to help decrease some of those symptoms. That could be one coping tool to help you. So there's a biological aspect.
Just to interrupt real quick, the important thing to me about the recognizing the biological piece is that I think it can be very validating to hear that it's not, you need to have this biological vulnerability or you won't develop an eating disorder. And I think it's just important for people to kind of take that in, that yes, that's part of it. That's not really the part that we can do as much with, which I know you're going to carry on to the other kind of components of it, but just really want to put out there too that yes, there are absolutely biological underpinnings for why people ultimately develop eating disorders. That's important.
Absolutely. And if I don't get back to this, remind me, Dr. Janine, because it's very important to think about it in terms of like any other disease model. I didn't cause my cancer, I didn't cause my diabetes, but I am responsible for managing it. So if I forget, bring me back. Okay?
Yeah, I will.
Because there's that biological aspect. Now, there's also the psychological aspect, which is we can do a lot about. We feel like there's a lot of different things that we can do to intervene there. So what we know is that kids or adults that develop eating disorders tend to have some underlying things that link them together. Not always, but often they do. And the research shows a few that I like to focus on because there's a lot that we can do with them. We know that these people tend to be kind of a little bit more anxious-natured. They tend to be extremely driven. And so this is why I want to say, these are not bad things, right? I mean...
Yeah, you're describing my personality, Kelsey.
I'm describing my own, too. It's probably half of your audience, Having extremely high levels of being driven is what brought, me through 10 years of school. When all my friends were going on to earn a paycheck, I decided to continue on with school. you decided to, create this incredible podcast that probably takes you a whole lot of extra time throughout your week. So we have these features that can lead us to really good things too. Being an anxious person makes us conscientious, so it's not necessarily a bad thing. Perfectionism, which we were talking about before, kind of that self-driven aspect of it. Recognizing what is important, maybe what other people want or need. Again, that's not necessarily a bad thing because that can help us connect and have good relationships with people. Now, any one of these things is not bad, but what happens is when a person has those genetic factors, those genes, right, that are being turned on by that right environment, which we'll talk about in a second, and now they've got the psychological aspects of being this people pleaser. I kind of know what other people want. I'm very driven. It's sort of like gasoline with a match to it. It's kind of how I like to describe it, right? So gasoline and a match on their own, not a big deal. Put them together, boom, you've got an explosive fire that's happening that is, again, part of that perfect storm. And somebody who can have more shame and can carry more shame because, again, they focus on what other people want and need. If they feel like they're not being able to deliver those services or deliver those things, they can feel more shame from that. And there's a huge difference between shame and guilt, so we can get back to that as well. I don't want to do too many side notes to confuse your audience, but we can talk about that a little bit more too. So all of those things together, we know that those things are just some of the factors, not all the factors, but some of the factors that are part of that perfect storm in the psychology aspects of an individual. And then the third primary factor in that perfect storm is what we call the social part. So we have biological we've gone through, the psychological, and now the societal or social impact. And all of us, let's just think, I want your viewers for a second to think about the society that we live in. And what are the messages that we hear every single day? You turn on the television, what are you going to hear? You're walking through the grocery aisle, what are you going to see on the cover of those magazines? It's all around us all the time, pushing us to achieve this thin ideal. That really is something that we're immersed in and emerged in all the time in our environment. The billboards we see down the highway, the messages that we see as we're checking out in the store, even the sizes of clothes that are in stores now. I talk to kids about, gosh, when I was a teenager, which I know they feel like it was a bazillion years ago, but in my mind, it wasn't all that long ago. I swear I can't remember seeing a size 00 or 000, right. Where the legs look like they go on forever, but they're about 2 inches wide. I don't remember that. Maybe there was, but I just don't remember that. And yet, those are very typical normal sizes that we see in stores that teenagers are going into all the time now. So those things communicate messages. So we have that. There's an estimate that there's about 5,000 messages per day that you're exposed to that reinforce that message of the thin ideal. Thin is in, this is what I need to be. So even if it's not being communicated to you directly all the time in your ear, you're being immersed in it and you're being impacted by it, all the time.
It's just that.
So our society is going to impact that. Now, in addition to that, you might grow up in a family where those things are really important, where, dieting is kind of an important thing, or being a smaller size is an important thing, or maybe you have friends that are really focused on this, or maybe you're into sports and as part of your sport, your coach says, hey, you have to look a certain way because you're going to fly higher in the air, or you're going to be, quicker on the court or whatever. So the more factors that we have all kind of pushing in on that individual, biological, social, psychological, all of those things, any combination of them come together and boom, that's where then we have the emergence of the eating disorder. And we can't predict it. Like you were saying, we can say that somebody would be more likely, but we never know exactly what the factors are that are going to be that make that happen for one individual that don't make it happen for the next individual.
Sure. Yeah, different person by person, and it takes several of them. It's not just one thing. So that's really what I want all of our parents to hear out there, is that it's not one thing. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the sociocultural model. We talked about this before we recorded the podcast episode, and will you tell our listeners what is that and how it is helpful for thinking about eating disorders and recovery?
Absolutely. It is. And I also want to stress to your viewers too, please understand that you did not cause this. So important, because thinking that can make you feel like, therefore, you're to blame and I can't then seek treatment. I'm just this horrible parent. So don't get caught up in that myth. It is a myth. You didn't cause that. These happen to great kids and great parents, and
Right.
can also survive this.
Right.
So the sociocultural model really focuses in on that social piece that I was just talking about, and it kind of, if you can imagine that as now, if we were looking at a PowerPoint, we would take that social piece and we would now expand it. So it's just helping us get a little bit more detail into that social piece and those social factors and some of the psychological factors. So what it says is that we are all, again, growing up in the United States, we are exposed to a culture that really reinforces the thin ideal. So we're all exposed to it. We're exposed to those 5,000 messages per day. But there's all the way to the end point of developing an eating disorder. And, as I said before, only less than 5% of us will probably end up actually having a clinical eating disorder. So there's got to be a whole lot in between that then helps us understand who are the people that are exposed and go all the way through to developing the eating disorder. So that's really what we're talking about when we talk about the sociocultural model. So the first step is that exposure, which we are all exposed to. Now, the next step is once we're exposed, most of us will go on to internalize these messages. And what I mean by that is to create values and ideals that go around those messages, to think that thinness is important, to think it's powerful. And you don't necessarily need to think that on a direct level. It's just these things happen more on a subliminal message level and happen indirectly. We may not even know we carry these ideals, but a lot of the things that we do, may reinforce that, even if we're unknowingly doing that.
Like even something as simple as like thin is good or thin is better or thin is healthy, that I think a lot of people think subconsciously.
Right. If you're overweight, couldn't possibly be healthy. And if you're thin, you must be. No, absolutely not.
Right.
You're right that those are internalized messages. Or even things like, hey, you look great. Did you lose weight? I mean, how many of us do that? It's a natural part of conversation. And would we say that we reinforce the thin ideal? Probably not. But it's
right.
just being reinforced within us, and I'm guilty of that too. I've probably said that to people before too. So again, and I do this for a living. I'm supposed to be aware of these things every single day. So we all kind of do this. It's just these indirect messages that we didn't realize were transmitted to us, and we picked up on those values. And most of us will internalize it. There are a few things that protect against that a little bit, and the research shows that maybe if you came from, say, a different culture that maybe feels differently, that maybe thin isn't in. There are cultures out there. Our kids in our program do not understand this, but there are cultures out there that think that thinness isn't good. And, that even if you go back in history, if you were thin, it meant that you were part of the lower SES or sociocultural economic status because you couldn't afford to eat. If you were rich, you were overweight. You had roles to show that you were, you could afford those things. So there was status in that. So it hasn't even always been this way, but it has been this way for a considerable period of time and for the entire lives of our children that have been exposed. So some people are protected against that a little bit if their ideals in their family or their culture do not support the thin ideal. Okay, so some of us will be protected, but most of us will actually internalize the messages. Now from there's that next leap. From those of us who have internalized the messages to those of us that go on to develop body dissatisfaction or a sense of, I'm not really quite sure I like my body, or I don't really think my body is good enough, or my thighs too big, is my stomach too big, those types of things. And if your audience members are thinking, oh my God, I do that, you're normal.
Welcome to the club.
Many of us do. You and I were talking before that I'm sure we can pick out, several things that we don't think are perfect on our bodies too. And again, I do this for a living, and it does not mean that I look in the mirror and I think I'm perfect in every single way, every single day. I don't. Now I tell kids that too, because that helps them to understand that a healthy body image is not going to be I'm perfect. It's I'm okay, even though I don't necessarily love everything about myself, right?
Yeah, and that there can be good days and bad days too.
Oh, gosh, yes. Don't we all have those days where we pick out a million outfits and they end up on the floor? It has nothing to do with the outfit. It has to do with the fact that we're not feeling good about ourselves. But we take it out on our outfits, right? So absolutely, there are those moments that we all go through as normal, healthy human beings, but we have these moments. And so about 80% of us, which you and I even discussed sounds a little bit low, will have some level of body dissatisfaction. But again, I want to stress to your viewers that most of us who have body dissatisfaction are not going to go on to develop an eating disorder. And so that's where, there's that biggest jump in the model, because that's the next leap is, okay, those people who then go on to develop body dissatisfaction, who are those then in between? Like, what happens in there that then leads to a development of an eating disorder? Because we go from 80% of the population estimated to then a whole 75% fewer, down to 5% are developing this clinical eating disorder. So what in the world is happening in that relationship? So I love to focus on that, because in that there's a ton of power, right? So if I can identify what are the factors that lead from the body dissatisfaction to the actual outcome of the eating disorder development, then we can do two things. So number one, from what I do, I work in a center where kids come in with clinical eating disorders. So I can find those things and I can target them and develop programs around them and intervene and decrease those factors and lead to protecting against continuing to grow that eating disorder and to help them develop that resilience that we were talking about earlier. There's another aspect to it that is really, really cool, which is called prevention, right? So
I love prevention.
It's amazing. It's awesome. So here at our center, we think about that too, as being part of Children's Health also believes in, as a part of population health, believes in prevention. So it's great that we get to work with these kids that, we need to intervene, but then we can also use that same thing to prevent before those next generation of kids are going to go on to develop it. We can actually take these factors, which are things like we were talking about before, shame, anxiety, perfectionism, and we can go and we can teach about those things, and we can actually help kids from stopping the development of it, which is just incredibly powerful. And that is what the sociocultural model really was initially based on. And I want to give a shout out to Eric Stice on that. He's the developer of it. I believe he came up with it in the 90s. A wonderful human being. He actually came and spoke all about that at our annual symposium. And that was really his initial intentions, was to talk about it as a prevention-based program. We're just lucky enough that we can also use it as an intervention-based program as well.
That's great.
Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I love everything that you said. I actually next want to ask you a couple audience questions. So I put out on my Facebook page that we would have a pediatric psychologist on to talk about eating disorders in kiddos. And I asked if anybody had any questions. And so a few people wrote back on that. So I thought I would ask you maybe a couple of these questions. And I think that you'll have opportunity to talk about guilt and shame, because I know that we should definitely hit on those topics too. So these two questions are by two separate people, but they're pretty closely tied together. So I'm just going to read them through and then have you respond. So I asked, does anybody have any questions for Dr. Latimer? And one person wrote, even though I'm years out from this, I think about it so much. What can parents do to help their kids develop a healthy relationship with food and a positive body image? Then another person wrote kind of a follow-up reply to that and said, yes, the question above. I have a 7-year-old son who already makes comments about why his butt is so big and why he doesn't have any muscles. Any advice for parents about helping their children develop a positive body image?
Okay, I love those questions.
Great questions.
They are, and what I think the second one really highlights is that this is not just a female-based issue.
Oh, yeah.
A lot of times we get caught up in thinking that, it's just girls that are dealing with this, and I can tell you at our center we work with boys as well. And also, did you say? I think you said he was 7 years old, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that also highlights that younger kids are being exposed to these things and developing clinical eating disorders. We've seen kids as young as 5 years old here at our center, even younger as well, having actually kind of traditional-based eating disorders like dieting and restricting and all of those things, and thinking that they need to be thinner. So it highlights that stuff too, which I think is so important. So thank you, whoever wrote in on that, asking about the boys as well, for reminding me to talk about that, because I just want to hit on that for a second. Boys are less likely to talk about this openly, and I think it's in our field there's an estimate that it's about maybe 90% of eating disorders impact females and about 10% impact males, and I think that we need to look at those numbers conservatively, because there's a lot of factors that impact that. And one of them would be the stigma that comes along with a boy talking about his body image, right? Mm-hmm. So, they're probably less likely to be open about it if they're experiencing it. And there's also a lot of sports that reinforce some of those images that they're getting, that even I don't want to demonize any particular sport, but one of the ones that jumps out to me is, some of the practices that might be considered actually to be normal within like wrestling. Hey, I need to take weight. I need to, drop 5 pounds overnight, right? So you can't do that in a healthy way. So thank you to that person that brought that out, because I don't think I've highlighted that. And it's a very, very, very important point. And also, you're doing exactly what I talked about, which is to listen to your parental instincts, and you're recognizing something. So just by doing that, you're doing way more than you know you're doing. Okay, so that's one of the things I want to highlight here as we get back to what can parents do. Number 1, do what you are already doing. Notice what is going on with your child. Don't ignore it. Don't think, well, maybe I'm overdoing this. Maybe I'm just being dramatic. You're not. You know your child, and if all of a sudden something hits you as, oh, that's weird, my child's saying that, listen to it. Or, I don't know, my child is doing this with food, but they never did before, but they tell me everybody does. Or they tell me that they've never liked ice cream, and they've always liked dry salad. These are actual examples that I've heard before.
Yeah,
and you
okay.
can get kind of, I just think, hey, wait a minute, maybe they always enjoy dry salad. So listen to those parental instincts always. So that's one thing that you can do, is don't ignore the messages. Another thing that you can do, when you hear about, and truly anything, not just with body image, but let's go back to anything else that is worrisome to you that makes you step back and say, oh, I don't know, that really hit me oddly. Whether it's a question about your child's safety or substances or a healthy, unhealthy relationships, things like that. If something hits you oddly, talk to your child about it. I can't stress that enough. Open up conversations. A lot of times as parents, we worry about, well, if I open up the conversation, am I going to give them ideas that they never knew about before? Am I going to suggest suicide to them? Am I going to suggest an eating disorder? Am I going to suggest that they diet? Have the conversation with them. Hey, I've noticed that you've been doing these different things. I want to talk to you about that. Or, hey, have you seen this stuff on, I've noticed that there's a lot of images in the media some of the stuff that you've watched on television that really look unhealthy. Like, how do you feel about that? I just kind of wonder how that affects you. And, does that make you wonder about how you feel about your body, or whether or not you should diet? I think about this one particular moment where I'm going to age myself again, because one of my family members is relatively young, and I remember watching television with her. And I remember watching this that was on a family network, okay? And it was just kind of promoting all of these promiscuous relationships within these teens, and they're all dieting, and they're all looking a certain way. And I thought, they're promoting this as kind of like this is normal, and it's on a family network. Oh my gosh, I don't remember being exposed to all of this stuff. There's no way this can't impact her.
Yeah.
And we just had a conversation about it, and she was so open with me about how it was impacting her. And, our kids are immersed in these things all the time. So have those conversations, be open about it, help them understand that those things are not normal just because they're being presented as normal. That doesn't mean everybody's doing these things. So talking is so incredibly important.
And for the little kiddos, making sure that they understand that pictures you see on magazines and billboards and all of that, those aren't real pictures. Those aren't real.
No,
those aren't real. Those are made up.
Exactly. And one of the most famous people in the world that your parents are probably going to know, I don't talk to kids about this because they're like, what? Who? What? You're old. But Cindy Crawford, right? So one of the world's most beautiful women and one of the world's most famous supermodels was known to say, I wish I looked like Cindy Crawford. Well, what does she mean by that? She doesn't mean like, I don't know who I am I psychotic? She means, I don't look like that. Even though I really am one of the most beautiful women in the world, I too have been airbrushed. I too don't look like that. And so it's so brave for her to come out and say that, because she's telling us, I'm not like that either. So even I wasn't perfect enough and had to be changed. And you're so right, because one of the things that we do in our program is we sit down and we watch the Dove campaigns, which are really awesome, by the way. If your parents don't know about them, they're all amazing. I highly encourage you to watch those with your kids. They're very, very impactful. They're just these little clips, like 3 or 4 minutes long. One of them is airbrushing and shows how this person who is quite beautiful to begin with was morphed into this billboard that looks nothing like her. And so we show that to our kids, and then we take a step back and we talk about it. And, we may assume as adults that every child understands and knows that the pictures are airbrushed. They do not. They have no clue.
No, they totally don't get it.
Totally. They think this is normal. And we know it's not, but they don't know it's not. And so they think, I don't look like that. And so I can tell you that there was one time that jumps out to me in watching this with one of our groups, that there was a kid that said, this changed my life, just watching this. This changed my life. I had no idea. And the whole group was just really just incredible in talking about that because they just didn't know. So have those conversations with your kiddos too. Now, other things that you can do as parents, model positive body image. Easier said than done, right? Because we may own our own issues with that. Does that mean you have to be perfect? Nope, it doesn't. It means being open about that. It means being aware and kind of catching yourself. That if you're thinking, oh my God, do I look fat in these jeans today? Don't talk to your kid about it. Talk to an adult that you're next to and saying, hey, I'm having a hard body image day. Can you help me through it? Talk to your husband, your wife, your partner, a friend, whatever. Just being aware of those things that we're saying, because even though you're not saying it about your child, it's what we call the transmission of values. So if mom doesn't think she looks good, if mom thinks I can't go out today because I don't look good in these jeans, which probably isn't even true, then that transmits messages to the child. Now, again, I want to say to your parents, most of us can think of moments that we've done that. Maybe you even did that this morning. It doesn't mean you're a terrible parent. It doesn't mean that you've done indestructible damage that you can't recover from. It just means increasing your awareness to it and thinking about other ways to communicate, when you're having those difficult moments. Also, making, when we compliment each other, which we talked about earlier today, when we compliment each other, it's so normal in our culture to say, oh my God, you look amazing today. Did you lose weight? We almost say it without even recognizing that we're saying it.
Right.
So I like to do things like, wow, you look incredible. Like, what's going on in your life that's so great?
Right. You look so happy.
So tell me, you look happy. You look amazing. You look joyful. Not you look thinner or you look even younger, right? Those are the things that we focus on. And so it's just about shifting that conversation a little bit. Also, one of the things that I think is so important is recognizing that healthy is not about one particular number on a scale. It is not about one size in a pair of pants. It is for that particular individual, healthy is going to be unique to them. So what is healthy for me, it is not necessarily healthy for you. What is going to be a healthy amount of food for me to eat is not going to necessarily be a healthy amount of food for you to eat. And so when we're working in our center with our kiddos, we have to help them to be aware that not only are they comparing themselves maybe on a number on a scale, but they may also be comparing the meals that they're eating. Some kids might have a higher meal plan than other kids based on what their body needs. So we have to help them understand it's all individualized. It is not in a particular number. It is not in a particular amount of food. So I think that's very important. And, I was talking to somebody this morning and joking around that if we took all of the myths out there about food and put them all together, we would probably just be left with water as the only thing that would maybe be considered healthy. And I'm sure that there's some other myths out there that say water is going to cause us cancer too. It's almost like we couldn't eat anything, right? Because all of these things have been demonized to do negative or terrible things to us. We're very afraid of fat or we're very afraid of carbs. We have to realize that those messages in society probably are trying to sell us something, to be honest.
Totally.
Right? And if we feel good about ourselves at the end of the day, a lot of people have a lot of money to lose. So even introducing to your viewers about being an educated consumer, taking a step back and saying, okay, well, what is this product trying to sell me right now? And do I want to do I want to fall prey to those messages? So those are things that we can do as well. And another thing is I want to stress to your viewers as parents, which I've been weaving in this entire time, again, go back to those parental instincts, listen to them. If you feel like there's something wrong, don't let your child's eating disorder or another disorder convince you otherwise. You know your child the best. Even when you come into treatment, we're going to tell you that. We're going to say, we're the experts in eating disorders. You're the expert on your child. So you know your child. Externalize that eating disorder. They are not their eating disorder, but believe me, if they've got one, it can speak loudly for them and say messages that would surprise you. It doesn't sound like your child. So there's a lot of things that you can do, and there's a lot of things that you're probably already doing as well.
And I would add just one on there, which is kind of a theme that we've been working through on the podcast and will continue to be a theme that in my wildest dreams and fantasies, as a culture, we would stop using weight as a measure of health. And so I think I think a lot of the times for parents, it's very scary, whatever weight their kid is at. I think there's kind of an idea of what it should be or what it should not be. And I think that it's really easy to get into talking about the body dissatisfaction openly, or talking about dieting openly, or maybe endorsing some patterns with exercise that aren't so healthy or helpful, because we're really afraid of different weights. And we always assume that weight is this ultimate measure of health. And research is actually telling us it's not a good measure of health. It's, minimal at best. It's not a strong indicator of health at all. So I think the more that you can do as an individual or as a parent or as a member of your family system to break that connection with thinking weight equals health, the better off you're going to be.
You are so right. And you and I working with eating disorders, we know this, that we've had some of our most serious kids, some of our most dangerous cases. Those kids come in looking great. They might be at their ideal body weight. They might look beautiful. And yet their body is completely deteriorated. Perhaps they have bulimia, which those kids come in at healthy weights, right?
Right.
And yet they might be on the brink of a heart attack. So you're so right, getting away from just thinking that what a person looks like on the outside means that, or their BMI, means that they're okay or not okay. So I love that you said that. And one other thing I'll add in there too is just, even though we're immersed in a culture that says all of these messages, we can do things to say other messages. I recently did an interview on the new Barbie shapes and skin tones, right? So cool, because we're now seeing that in dolls. Go buy your child a different type of doll. Have a discussion about it. It was really cute too, because the kids were saying, "Oh my gosh, this doll looks like me," or "This doll looks like my," and so there's other things out there that introduce different ideals as well. And I think the more that we're exposed to these different things, it just helps us to not focus on one particular size or one particular weight that you were saying, or even one particular skin tone,
Yeah. And we totally don't have time to get into this, but maybe we'll do another episode in the future to kind of follow up. But and I'm writing an individual episode on this. It just takes me forever to get them done. But really, I feel like it's really helpful also to see your body so much beyond just the weight and the shape. And I feel like we just narrow in on that, especially if you have an eating disorder. But really, like this little 7-year-old boy who's worried about his butt. It's like, butts are actually pretty cool. Like, did you know that you get, it helps you out because you get to sit on it every day and it connects your back and your legs, and every part of your body is doing so much for you.
Exactly. Yes.
And only focusing on the weight, I think, is just really reductive and just completely, it's just not an accurate way of viewing your body at all.
So right. And again, like one of the things that your viewers may find helpful is even shifting the word. Like, I don't have the word exercise in my vocabulary, because when I think about exercise, I think about calories, burning off those calories, weight loss, all of that stuff. In my vocabulary, only the word activity exists. Because when I think of activity, I think about joy. I think about body movement for joyous reasons, because I love to be outside and take a run out there and feel the wind in my hair. Or because I feel energized and it gets me ready to do a podcast where I can have a little bit of energy and seem like I've gotten 8 hours of sleep from it. Those types of things, because I want to, not because it's a command from some outside message that I have to or look a certain way. So it's about what's coming internally. So that may be even just shifting your language a little bit can be helpful. Like, do I want to be active today versus do I want to exercise?
Yeah, that's great. I got myself out of the habit of saying working out, because it really just feels very transactional. I ate something, now I have to work it off. I still have been saying exercise, so I think I'll change that, because when I talk with clients about it, I'll always say, like, what joyful movement would you like to do? Because you should do something that's fun. Like, if you want to go do Zumba, go do Zumba. Or if you want to go do yoga, whatever. Okay, I do have a couple more questions that I want to ask you if you're up for that.
Sure.
Okay. This is written by one person, but it's 2 pretty separate questions. So I'll just lump them together and we'll just kind of go through it if that's okay. This person asked, what are ways parents can encourage a healthy lifestyle, eating right, exercising, etc., without pushing their children to feel self-conscious or leading them into disordered eating? Then the separate question is, what can a parent do to support their child and accept that they have an eating disorder if they do have one?
Yeah. Oh, I love those.
Both really good questions.
Those are really good questions. So I think, again, on the healthy lifestyle, I loved all of that except the word right.
Me too.
Because that kind of is exactly what we've been talking about. There is no right or wrong. It's about balance. And I wish I had, sometimes we feel better having like a top 5 list. I can't give you that because it simplifies it too much. It's really not about that. It's not black and white. It's going to be more in the gray, and it's about balance. So you and I were talking about the entire time, listen to those gut instincts as a parent. You know what's right for your child, and each child is different.
Right.
So listening to that and recognizing that balance is going to be different for everybody, that health and size and all of those things are going to be different for everybody. One of the things that we like to talk about parents with is, they might say, well, I did this and it worked with this kid. Well, recognize that this child might be a little bit different. Maybe they're more sensitive. Maybe, they're a little bit more difficult to soothe. So looking at each child individually, I think is very important for parents to recognize. What was that second question that you were asking?
The second one was, what can a parent do to support their child and accept that they have an eating disorder if they do have one?
Yes. And I think I've sort of answered this before is, one of the most important things that families can do is recognize the power of eating disorders. There's a big term called anosognosia. Say that. I challenge you to say that 5 times fast. But really all it means is denial. And it means being unaware that you have a disorder. So realize that it is incredibly common. And I think most people that have eating disorders typically are experiencing some of that, where their eating disorder is about protecting itself. It needs to convince the child that it's there to help them. They often don't even realize that they have it. And they're not going to most likely come to you. It does sometimes happen where kids come to parents and say, hey, I have a disorder. But it usually isn't like that. So why I'm saying that is because the denial, because eating disorders are so manipulative, the denial can then move past just the child and be kind of caught, by the family. So the family can kind of buy into some of these things that the child is saying, really not knowing that they're speaking through their disorder. They might think, well, my child was always thin, or my child is having these stomach pains. And it's very possible that they are. But please, if you're seeing those things, go and take your child to the doctor and listen to the doctor. If the doctor says, we've ruled out the test, it's not a GI issue, this is really a psychological issue, it can be hard to handle that, because then you do have to maybe deal with, does that mean I'm to blame for this? Does that mean I did these things? And again, you didn't.
Right.
But it just means that it's a different path that we're going to take for treatment. And it's actually a good thing. There's a lot of very, very good outcomes that can come from receiving treatment. But please, to your viewers, do not ignore the signs when you see them, and catch them early. What we know is that the earlier an eating disorder is treated, the better the likelihood is for it to not become a chronic issue, because they can become chronic over time.
Right.
And if you think about just a child's development and their identity development, the longer they have the eating disorder, the longer it wraps around their identity. So the less amount of time, then the easier it is to overcome that and find healthier coping skills, which really can happen. These things can be very well treated. So I think that that's the most important thing. Listen to that, get treatment early, realize that if you think an eating disorder is happening, it probably is, even if your child's likely going to try to convince you it's not. They may say things like, I don't have a problem, you're overreacting, all of those things. All of that means is that we've got some anosognosia going on. It's okay, and that can be treated as well.
Right. And I always stress the point that there's really this is for adults too, not just parents with kiddos who might be having some stuff going on with an eating disorder, but there's really no harm in checking it out. To me, the worst case scenario is you call somebody about potential treatment, you do like an initial consultation, or you have like an initial meeting at wherever, and they say, yeah, actually you don't need to be here. Great. Then exactly. At least you checked it out. No harm, no foul. So,
and what that does is, it kind of goes back to the discussion I was having earlier with you about talk to your child about different things. If you open up a discussion about, hey, have you ever tried to hurt or harm yourself? Or have you ever had some of those feelings? You're not going to plan that for them. What you're going to do is open up a conversation. The worst that can happen is they say no. You realize your child's okay. And then if they ever do develop those things, they know they can come and talk to you about it. So it's the same thing with a professional, If you go to a professional and you don't need the treatment, well, having that positive experience with a professional then opens up, if I do have something in the future, I can go back
Right.
because I know that it wasn't as scary as I thought it was going to be.
Right.
That sort of thing. So it's a really good point.
It's not, I hope it's not usually that scary. I know it's hard to kind of confront these things, but I mean, really, you're going to be talking to somebody like me or like you. I don't think we're so scary.
I try not to think of myself as so scary, but I am. I will say that I'm scary for an eating disorder because I'm never on the side of the eating disorder. I'm always on the side of the kiddo. Okay. But like you're saying, we as professionals, if you're skilled in this, you meet a child where they're at. You meet a family where they're at. If a child is not recognizing they have an eating disorder, I'm not going to go in guns a-blazing saying, yes, you do, right? It's going to be like, okay, so you don't have that. So what do you have going on? What can we help you with? Mm-hmm. And we find those little moments of that openness, and we create it very slowly over time. So we want to help decrease the natural defensiveness that comes along with that, and definitely just creating, sometimes like you're saying, the best thing that we can do is just create a good experience. So when that person is ready, then they'll come back and they know that it wasn't that scary.
Right. And kind of shifting gears, because I know that we've mentioned it a few times and we didn't have very much time to kind of talk about it. And we could unpack this subject at length for sure. But I'm wondering if you can speak to the difference between guilt and shame and how maybe that's experienced by kids who have eating disorders and then also the parents of those kids. So I think it's so important to understand that difference.
Yes, I love this topic, and you're right, we could talk about that for hours. So you're probably going to have to edit me a lot on this particular one. It is so critical, and most people don't realize that there is a difference between shame and guilt. We kind of use those terms interchangeably, but they're not. They're very, very different, and all of us experience them. So the example that I like to use to help us kind of get a sense of the difference. So if I went into a candy store and I stole some candy, I'm going to feel guilty about that. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, because what that does is then kind of act as a little bit of a moral compass for me. It's like, that didn't really feel good. Like, that doesn't fit with my values. I don't really see myself like that. I don't like that feeling I got from that thing. So that can be actually a very good thing, right? Because the next time I go into a candy store, I'm probably not going to do that. So it's recognizing that a thing that I have done that's external for me didn't fit with me, didn't fit with how I see myself internally, rather, and therefore I'm not going to do it again. So it can be like a really good thing to help you develop a sense of conscientiousness about different things.
Yeah, guilt is just meant to be feedback.
Yeah,
what I did doesn't fit with who I want to be.
Right. Now, the difference is when it turns from guilt into shame. And so let's say that same example. I went into the candy store and I stole the candy. And now I'm going way further from, that didn't feel good. I don't like that. I'm never going to do that again. I did a bad thing, to perseverating on that. Oh my God, that thing now defines who I am. I am now that bad thing that I have done. I am a thief rather than I am somebody who stole the candy. Mm-hmm. And so it goes from being external to internal. And so it becomes an internal dialogue, and starting to label yourself. I always look at guilt as being something that can be, like you said, positive feedback. It can help you move forward and kind of like push out things that didn't really feel right and help develop yourself. It's good to experience guilt at some points in our lives. Whereas shame, I have never seen that be a positive thing. I only see that as being a damaging thing with individuals. It encourages secrecy. It encourages keeping things inward. It encourages feeling very badly about yourself and who you are. And you and I talked about this earlier, that when it comes to an eating disorder, people think it is guilt. People think, I feel guilty when I've eaten that, whatever, fill in the blank. And I always turn that to, no. It's not guilt that you felt. It is shame that you felt. Yeah. And shame is like miracle grow for that eating disorder. That eating disorder loves that. So the more shame that you experience, the more internalized you become, the more secret you become, the more you need the eating disorder to make you feel better. And it becomes this extremely dangerous kind of cycle that happens. That is how I see it with eating disorders. It happens all the time where they experience shame. Now, when we can, like you said, kind of unpack that and help them realize that why would you feel shame for taking care of your body? I want you to really, the eating disorder wants to keep everything internal. Let's look at it externally. Let's write it down, exactly what it's telling you, and let's just kind of look at it rationally. Does this feel rational? Would you think about this in the same way, if it were your best friend? Mm-hmm. What part of that might be true? What part of that might not be true? So getting the conversation outward and just saying it, I always think to myself, well, really, why is it that therapy works? I ask myself this a lot. And I think one of the things that makes a huge difference is we're taking internal conversations that we're afraid to say, and we're bringing them outward. And sometimes when we can convince ourselves that 2 + 2 = 5 if we want to. Very smart people do it all the time. But when you say it out loud, then you can catch yourself and be like, wait a minute, maybe 2 + 2 doesn't equal 5. And then other people around you could be like, 2 + 2 definitely doesn't equal 5. And, it allows people to kind of come inward, provide support, and help us to sort of challenge that shame that's happening within the individual. And extending beyond that, you were saying, well, what about families? And families can sometimes feel this a lot, and I do think that it can sometimes prevent them from receiving treatment because they might feel like if I go in there, they're going to for sure think I'm a horrible parent because my child is 30 pounds underweight. And a lot of times parents may start the conversation with explaining everything they didn't do wrong. And when they do that, that they're feeling that internally. And so, I'll just stop and talk to them. It sounds like you're feeling a lot of shame. Let's talk about this. Let's talk about this perfect storm that we started with earlier today. And let's talk about where your power is. Recognizing some of the things that maybe you're not happy that you've done is great because then you have the power to change that. But did you cause it? No. You absolutely didn't cause it. And we need to help you forgive yourself for those things because that shame is going to do the same thing to you. And shame is contagious for eating disorders. It likes to come out and affect the family too, because then everyone can own the secret of the eating disorder, right?
Yeah. And I think part of what makes shame so powerful is that I think it feels really immobilizing for people because when you are bad, what are you going to do about that? So if you're out there as a mom thinking, I'm a bad mom, I'm a bad dad right now, that is shame.
When the reality is no, you're not. You probably just didn't see something, or maybe you did, and you convinced yourself it wasn't a problem because the eating disorder convinced everybody it wasn't a problem.
Of course.
And it can happen. Or maybe you heard something else and it sounded really logical to you at that point in time, and that's okay. It just is a mistake, or it's just something that was missed, or, children don't come with manuals on how to recognize all these things. That's all right. It doesn't make you a bad parent because you missed something, but it makes you a very good parent that you brought your child in for treatment. And that we can work with, right? I've never seen a parent that brought their children in for treatment that wasn't a good parent. That is being a really good parent because you're recognizing when you did see something, now I need to do something about it. And that goes back to the conversation I was saying to you earlier about am I to blame? Kids often think I am to blame for having this eating disorder. I've done this to myself and my family and all of that. And the answer to that is no, you didn't. This is something that happened to you. This is something that happened to your family. Now, just like diabetes, cancer, all of those things happen to your family, happen to you, you are not to blame for that happening to you. However, you are responsible for then managing it.
Right.
So like when you find out you have diabetes, are you to blame for all of the things that didn't work, that inflamed your disorder before that? No, but now you know that there are certain things that maybe don't align with your health, and now you need to manage that. Same thing with an eating disorder. Now we know what this is called, and we have a name for it. We know what we can do about it, and so it is one of those things you're going to have to manage. You're going to have to be aware that during certain points in your life, you might be more vulnerable to having these things pop up again, and your responsibility is to take a step back and say, I need to manage this now. Same thing with parents. When parents see those things happening again, now they're responsible to manage that and to not ignore it and to do the things that they can do to empower themselves and their children.
Yeah. Everything you said, Dr. Latimer, was so well said. And I really hope that I know people are going to get so much out of listening to this episode, and really hope that they're kind of taking away, not feeling any shame about these things and being able to kind of just get some good info out of this. Did we miss anything that we had talking about? I feel like we got through our whole list and you gave us so much to think about.
If they have questions, that come out of this, like, I am happy to further clarify those, or like you and I talked about, if your viewers feel like it would be helpful to come back at a different point in time, I'm very happy to do that too. And I want to thank you, Dr. Anderson, for number one, giving us a platform to talk about these things is so powerful.
Oh, thank you.
And just recognizing some of the things that I didn't mention and highlighting those. So I so appreciate you giving us the time today to talk about these things.
Well, thank you so much for joining us. This was just a wonderful, wonderful interview. I'm sure we'll have you back on if in the future you're willing to. We'd love to have you back because there's so much we could talk about, really. If people want to learn more about you or the Center for Pediatric Eating Disorders, where should they go?
Yes, great question. They can come to www.childrens.com, and they can search for the Center for Pediatric Eating Disorders. We're right on there. We are a great center. We treat, as I was saying, boys and girls, and people ages 5 and above is typically what we take. They can also, if you have a web page and you want to put a link up there or any information, I'm happy to provide that for you as well.
I'll put a link in the show notes for this, so people who are listening through another platform like SoundCloud or iTunes, whatever you're listening to this on, there will be a link in the show notes so you can get to that site. So I'll put that in there for everybody.
And what I can also do there for you is, this might bring up, I wouldn't be surprised if this brings up questions where people are like, I don't know, maybe my child does have an eating disorder. We are a wonderful community resource. We are happy to answer your questions. We have an intake coordinator that does that all the time. If you have questions about, I don't know if my child has an eating disorder or if they meet criteria, our intake coordinator is happy to answer some of those as well. So I'll provide that phone number for you guys too.
That sounds wonderful. We'd be so grateful for that. Well, thank you so much for joining us today. I love talking to you. So helpful, so much great information. And I think that people are going to walk away from this feeling so much relief and with a lot to think about and have learned a lot. So thank you for joining us, Dr. Latimer, and I'm sure we'll talk again in the future.
Great. Thank you so much.
Thanks for joining me for another episode. Let's keep in touch. You can find all the information you need about the podcast at eatingdisorderrecoverypodcast.com, including full podcast episodes and links to all of our social media sites. You can join our Facebook group for the podcast by searching Eating Disorder Recovery Podcast on Facebook. This is a closed group for listeners of the podcast looking to connect, share resources, and get involved in a pro-recovery community. Don't forget to subscribe to the podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, or YouTube. Please leave us a review and let us know how we're doing. Talk to you next time on the Eating Disorder Recovery Podcast. This podcast is produced by me, Dr. Janine Anderson, and Elise Barbuck.